Hello, everyone. This is Nicholas Catman with the FDA Group. Welcome to the Life Science Rundown. Before we jump into our discussion for today, just a little bit about the FDA Group. We help life science companies in the areas of quality assurance, regulatory affairs, clinical operations, commissioning, qualification, and validation, as well as pharmacovigilance. We offer three different engagement models, which are consulting, staff augmentation, and full-time employer recruitment. So if you ever find yourself in need, just head over to thefdagroup.com to check us out and get in touch. Today, I think I'm having my first repeat guest on the podcast, Dave Marlin. Dave, welcome back.
Thank you, Nick. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about something different today. I know the first podcast we were talking about leadership and management. Today we're going to be talking about a esoteric area of life sciences that I don't think gets discussed a lot. So we'll send out that teaser and let everybody wait to find out what that is. In the meantime, would you please reintroduce yourself and maybe even give us a little bit of background in terms of how you kind of got started?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks again, Nick, for having me back. I'm excited to be here. My company, Medicament Systems, we help companies pay out royalties. So I got started in this space. I was a programmer at a healthcare information systems company in Boston many years ago. I went to business school. When I got out of business school, I worked for American Express and did marketing for American Express. And that wasn't quite the right fit for me. And I wanted to somehow merge these two skills, marketing and programming. And I had an opportunity to go off and do some IT consulting, and it eventually morphed into an opportunity to build some royalty software. This was back in 99, 2000. And so I built this software, and the guy I built it for, we became partners and we started Medicament Systems. And now we provide royalty automation payout platforms to about 200 customers.
Okay, very cool. Thank you. So, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about royalties today. And as I'm sure your listeners know, life sciences is a very intellectual property oriented business. There's a lot of IP that's licensed from others, that's used and monetized. And so whenever you have intellectual property being licensed, there's usually royalties involved. And there's a few different areas in the life sciences where royalties come into play. Perhaps the biggest area is on in what I would call sort of the biotech companies, the ones that, in my definition of biotech, create products that are used by the rest of the industry. So, for example, we work with companies that manufacture reagents and things like monoclonal antibodies. And these products are often invented in university labs or sometimes by individual physicians and doctors and sometimes by other companies. And these labs don't have the infrastructure or the desire to manufacture these at scale, but they found a really valuable reagent or a really valuable monoclonal antibody that the rest of the world can use to help develop their drugs, to help their research. And so these biotech companies license these technologies from these universities and other sources, and they create these products at scale, and then they sell those products, and then they have to pay royalties back to whoever they licensed it from, which is in the terminology for that is a licensor. So the manufacturer is a licensee. They licensed it from a licensor. And so every time a payment comes in from one of these products, they have to pay out those royalties. Royalties also play a big role in pharma. So, as many of you know, drugs take sometimes decades, hundreds of millions, or even billions of dollars to bring those to market. And so the pharma industry often works where you kind of have, I don't want to call them bottom feeders, but these kind of like entry-level companies that invent a compound that might be useful for a drug at some point down the road. And then sort of a bigger fish licenses that technology from them and they'll develop it further. Maybe they'll do some, phase one clinical trials or something like that. And if it shows promise, a bigger company will license it from them. And then
Mm.
ultimately, if it proves effective, a big pharmaceutical company will license it and bring it to market. And there's a chain of royalties that has to go all the way down. So from the pharmaceutical company down to the intermediaries, they have to pay royalties every time they sell those products. And sometimes those products are created or embedded in other technologies like these reagents that I was talking about. And so they might have to pay royalties to the companies that invented those reagents. And then the final area where we see royalties in life sciences is in the medical device space. Just as an example, when I was a kid, my father invented this piece of dental equipment. If you've
Mm.
ever had a root canal,
I
um,
did.
oh, good. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
maybe not, but I don't wish it on you. But
My tooth was already dead, so I don't think that I actually got any pain medication because there was no
oh,
nerve.
oh, wow, I have
Yeah.
one of those.
Yeah.
Yeah, got it knocked out playing hockey years ago.
Yeah, my brother hit me in the face with a badminton racket.
All right, all right. Um, so my dad, he was an endodontist, dentist that specializes in root canals. And when you do a root canal, you got to drill into the root
Right. Clean
and
it.
get all the gook out of
Yeah.
there. And then you fill it with this substance called gutta percha. And they used to just kind of have to scrape and stuff the gutta percha in. And my dad was very much a tinkerer. And so he, along with a couple colleagues, invented this tool where you just stick this thing in. It's now called an obtura, and it just fills that space with gutta percha. So if you've ever had a root canal, my dad's tool was probably used to fill that. And for
When was it
years,
invented?
what's that?
When was it invented?
Probably in like the late 70s, early 80s.
Oh, okay. So
That's
yeah,
he says
definitely, definitely. I wasn't even born, so okay.
yeah, yeah. He says it paid for us to go to college. So, because he would get royalties, so a medical device
Oh,
company acquired the patent for it, and he would get royalties. And then every few years, because patents last 17 years, he would come up with a better version of it, and the medical device company was psyched because they could keep offering newer versions of it. So for decades, he was getting royalties on those medical device sales. So that's
wow.
that's another way where royalties make their way into the life sciences space.
So I got two questions. What is a so if I think about a royalty and I have to pay somebody one person once a year, that's something that's very easy for me to do. I can imagine that not being a burden.
That's right.
At what scale do things start to become a challenge? And then can you paint a picture for what a complex environment that is responsible for either paying or receiving royalties would look like? And just so I can kind of like, I'm imagining in my mind, there's a house, and inside that house is a bunch of problems with royalties. Can you open that door just so I can kind of see what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. So you're absolutely right. If you just licensed out, one or two or a few technologies and there's just a single licensor, that's really pretty straightforward. It can get complicated because there can be different rules. So, you might pay like if you're licensing out from a tech transfer office, that's the name of the entity at a university that typically takes the technologies developed in the labs and brings them to market and licenses them to various manufacturers. So typically a university discovered product would go through the tech transfer office and they'll negotiate a deal where if it's sold as a therapeutic, you'll get 1%. If it's sold as a diagnostic tool or component, you'll get a different rate. If it's sold for research use, you'll get a different rate. If it's sold in different territories, you'll get different rates. So there's some countries, this I find fascinating. There's some countries and territories that have minimal or no patent protection capabilities. And those, the manufacturer will still sell into those spaces, but they can negotiate a lower rate if they sell into those countries because there's nothing really, they don't really have to pay a royalty on it. So,
Mm.
so there'll be different rates in those in those countries that have less patent protection. And some countries they might sell it at different rates for. So you throw in is it therapeutic, diagnostic, research? What territory was it sold in? And then you have these concept of tiers where sometimes as the volume of sales go up, oftentimes the royalties will go up. Sometimes they go down, but they'll often change. So, the first $50,000 of sales might pay one rate, and then the next 50,000 or 100,000 might pay a different rate.
Mm.
And then you have another complexity that you have is the concept of multiple licensors. So you might have a reagent that was developed in conjunction with two universities. So two universities, tech transfer offices get together and they say, okay, we're going to now license this out to be manufactured. It's a super valuable monoclonal antibody that everybody's going to need. And so then you might have to pay royalties to two entities or three entities. So you have that level of complexity. So that right there, if it was just one rate for one
Mm.
licensor, which sometimes it is, that's easy enough. You start getting all these complexities and it starts becoming very difficult and very easy to make mistakes. And
Yeah,
start multiplying that. We usually find like once you hit like a dozen or so of those agreements, it just becomes overwhelming. And
yeah.
then to add to that complexity, there's this concept of multiplexing, where you'll have multiple products in a single product. You'll have multiple pieces of IP in a reagent.
Okay.
So a single reagent is being maybe sold to pharma companies for them to put their drugs into. Pardon my ignorance on exactly how they use it, but so we've created the manufacturers created this product, and they owe X amount to this university, X amount to this university. So there's a bunch of different components in there
Oh,
that have to. So it's not that the universities shared the IP. It's that it's got different IP from multiple universities, and that's often called multiplexing or stacking or kitting. And so that adds complexity.
yeah,
So it starts to become
yeah,
exponentially complex as you get
yeah.
more tools like that.
Yeah, I can imagine the nightmare of trying to manage that on an Excel spreadsheet. And if you entered in the rule the wrong way, that's going to cause a problem. But each time you're supposed to go to that sheet, you're going to have to reread the rules in order to implement whatever you're supposed to do. Then when you go to implement, there's another opportunity for error. So yeah, I can certainly see a bunch of different points at which an error could be made. Um, One of the things I said when I was asking for the overview is whether you're paying or receiving royalties. Is there a difference between paying and receiving royalties?
Yeah, so there is a difference. I mean, conceptually, it's all related. Because you'll set up a contract, a tech transfer office will set up a contract with a biotech manufacturer, and that single contract will dictate both what the manufacturer is allowed to do and what royalties are coming in, but also for that manufacturer, how to calculate those royalties. What are the rules for calculating those royalties? So the tech transfer office, which is the licensor in this case, their concerns are different. They want to make sure that A, they're getting paid correctly, they're getting paid on time. They want to be able to keep track of what intellectual property is being licensed for how. So maybe they may have licensed it just for therapeutics, but not for diagnostics. So they need to be able to track that. And on the flip side, the manufacturer needs to do all these calculations and be able to support an audit or just be able to support the why they're paying what they're paying. So it's all very similar and related, but they're very different processes and systems that are required.
Mm. You mentioned contracts, and you kind of talked about some of the complexities in these agreements, which I thought was interesting. Is there anything else as it pertains to contracts and agreements that you could kind of share with the audience, or should we move on from that point?
Well, there is actually one other thing that adds to the complexity and difficulty of doing this manually. which is this concept of advances or minimum guarantees. So sometimes a tech transfer office will say, okay, you can license this, you can have exclusive rights to this technology, but we know this is a popular technology. So you have to agree that you're going to pay us at least $1 million a year in royalties.
Mm,
And so the company licensing it, if they're under that threshold for the year, they have to make up the difference.
right.
Conversely, um, they might prepay that. So the company might say, okay, the tech transfer office might say, okay, we want you to prepay us that $1 million, which some people call an advance, some people call it a prepaid minimum guarantee. So the manufacturer will then have to know, okay, we already prepaid this, so the first million in royalties, we're not going to send them anything. But as soon as we hit 1 million in royalties, we have to start sending them money. So that is another area that's very difficult to track those balances from one period to the next to the next. And it's an area that creates a lot of errors.
Okay. So you did a good job in terms of explaining kind of the complexity and the environment. I can see all the different points at which there could be error, and that's what creates a big challenge. Is there anything else that adds to that complexity that you haven't already covered, or have you covered pretty much the whole gambit?
Well, there are some some subtleties. There's where do you get the information from? How do you keep track of,
Oh,
which so a sale will typically have a SKU, so the manufacturer, the biotech company
oh,
will have some kind of an ERP system with SKUs in it,
yeah.
and they have to know that that SKU contains these intellectual property components. But most of it I've covered in that description.
What are So here's another thing I'm thinking, right? So my mind with all of these rules goes to software being a solution, right?
Mhm.
Automated software. Um, and I mentioned Excel spreadsheets.
Mhm.
Are those the only two ways that people are handling it currently, or are there other ways that people are handling it besides Excel spreadsheets and automated software?
That's a good question. So at the extremes, yes, you can fully automate this process with software, or you could fully do it manually with Excel. In
Okay.
some other industries, I actually met some accountants that were doing it with the old, I don't even remember what you call it, but on paper with, the old
Where you
account.
pull the thing?
No, no, no. They have these
Oh,
like these accounting t kind of paper where you get all these accounts and you're just manually like
real
putting
real
this over.
paper?
Yeah, yeah, I've seen that. That was decades.
Oh.
I've been doing this a little too long, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's basically you're either doing it in Excel or you're doing it in a fully automated royalty system. But there's these other in between kind of solutions, like some of these big intellectual property systems, they tend to be really focused on managing what licenses you have to license out. Are people paying you? And they claim to have a royalty payout module, but it's pretty rudimentary. So you still have to do a ton of work in Excel. So you can get
Is
some of it automated, but you're still doing a lot of it in Excel and then figuring out how to get it back in there. So there's so it's usually on that continuum. They either are doing it purely in Excel or they have a system that can kind of help them out, but it's still a very difficult process.
um what are we talked about the different touch points at which errors can be made,
Mhm.
but you also alluded to like pulling information, placing it somewhere. What are all the different types of systems that life science companies are currently managing in order to manage this process currently? Because it sounds like it's several.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. So there's typically, I so in my mind it's very straightforward, but if you're not in this space, it seems kind of overwhelming and very complex because there are a lot of systems. So there's typically five types of data that you require to automate your royalties, to manage your royalties even. So
Okay.
There's the contract info. So the rules that are stored in those contracts, and that tends to be the most complex data.
Okay, we'll
Um,
say that's in Dropbox or SharePoint.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Although some of these intellectual property management tools let you record it, but they don't let you record it in enough detail to really automate the process. So yes, often these are often just PDFs that are stored in Dropbox or someone's email or something. Um, then you have your sales data. So these manufacturers, these biotech companies they're selling, they probably have some kind of an order entry system. It might be part of like an ERP, like a NetSuite or an Oracle or a SAP or a Dynamics, and they're storing and they're entering their sales information into those systems.
Okay.
And that sales data needs to get processed through the rules. So we somehow have to get that
Mm.
sales data into the royalty process. Then there's the product data. So there's, okay, SKU number 123 has this piece of intellectual property from
Oh,
University of California, this piece of intellectual property from the University of
well,
Alabama. So this SKU, we have to know what intellectual property it's associated with. So that's like
uh,
product related data.
and I don't mean to interrupt you. I know you're on kind of number 3 out of 5. Um, the other thing that's striking me is not only how many points there are for human error, but also how many trigger points there are that could be forgotten or missed.
Totally. Yes, absolutely. And there's a way to catch that, which
Okay.
is, um, in that sales data, and this is where a dedicated royalty system really one of the places it can really shine because it has this
Mm,
capability. If sales come in and that royalty system receives those sales, it will know either do I have a contract in a way to process these sales or do I not? And if I don't, let those people know so they can fix the issue, right? So you can use the sales as a safety net to make sure you're capturing everything. So if a SKU comes in for a sale, but we don't know what intellectual property that SKU is associated with, that sets off red lights, warning signals. And so you can, okay, let me figure that out, get those into the system. Similar for contract, we forgot to enter the contract rules. So, okay, we got this SKU, but we don't know the rules to pay it out. So the sales data can act as a safety net. And that's one of the great things about having an automated process. If you're doing this in Excel or with one of these intermediate tools, you're going to miss sales data. We see that all the time.
mhm,
Um,
mhm. Um,
should I go to the last two types, or do you have a follow-up
yeah, go
question?
to the last 2 types and then I got a question.
Okay, so once the royalties are calculated, you've got payment information that needs to get input into some kind of an accounts payable system so that the licensors can actually get paid. So usually that's your ERP system. You have an accounts payable in there, but sometimes it's a third party electronic payment system. So that's one other piece. And then the last piece is the accrual information. So virtually every
Oh,
company out there needs to know what kind of royalty accruals. It's a
yeah,
critical balance sheet item.
yeah.
What kind of royalty accruals they have. Some of them want it at the product level, some of them want it at the higher contract level. Some of them just want the whole thing. They don't care at that level of detail. So
And
however
these
they
and these
want
and
it,
these accruals are significant enough that they're material,
they are
right?
material and they have to
Okay.
get on the balance sheet. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they have to be trued up. So a lot of times what they'll do is they'll have, okay, for January, we estimate our accruals are going to be this, and then they have to put an adjustment for what they actually are.
Oh, okay. Yep. Yep. Okay, got it. Um, question I had is what is, let's say, I'm going to go back to my earlier point. I got one royalty I have to pay to one person once a year, right? That's as easy as it gets,
And that
right?
exists. There are
Okay.
situations like that. Yep.
At what, right? But so, and then there's no, I like this, I heard recently, there's no solutions, only trade-offs, right? So, the trade-off is I have to invest in a system that's going to allow me to not cause errors and reduce my stress. And in the meantime, I'm going to use Excel or I'll use some of these rudimentary in between systems. But I'm a huge fan of automation because I mean, there's just so many benefits, right?
Hmm.
So, at what point does somebody know they've reached a situation where that's enough? We need to go and get a full solution. I'm sure there's stories, situations, things you've seen over and over again. What does that look like?
Yeah, so usually it's there becomes a level of anxiety that goes, you have your royalty administrator who's doing this, and they'll typically have a boss, maybe a controller who might report to the CFO, who reports to the CEO. When that level of anxiety rises to the controller
Oh,
or CFO level,
oh yeah.
then that's often a trigger. So what creates that? So it's like there's concern with accuracy.
Hmm.
There's just not a certainty. One of our customers once told us that in this space, trust and reputation are critical. And if you're making mistakes and a
Oh
tech
yeah.
transfer office finds out, or another company you're licensing to finds out, they're not going to want to license stuff to you in the future. And you're going to get a
Uh,
reputation too. So if there's that anxiety, that's one thing that can trigger it. Another thing that can trigger it is, okay, you've got this person who initially this was just supposed to be like a 5 hour a week thing or a 5 hour a month thing. But now all of a sudden it's taking them a week a month or, 5 weeks a quarter or something.
yeah.
And there's other stuff that has to get done. So you're in that position of, okay, I either have to hire someone or I've got to get this automated. And a lot of times, just knowing that someone is spending, because what we usually see is if you get it really well automated, you save 90 to 95% of your effort. So, if you're, we had customers that were, in some other industries that were, they had to pay royalties twice a year and they had a full-time person doing it. And they often had to bring in a second person.
Oh,
They were able to get that process down to like 2 weeks every 6 months. Uh,
okay.
so that's like a 95% reduction in effort. And
Yeah,
so
right.
now they had this person who 5 years ago was a critical person in many other aspects of the business and slowly got sucked into this.
Yeah.
Now she could do some other things that were really high value. She reported in that case directly to the CEO, and the CEO was finding he was doing stuff that he
Oh
shouldn't.
my God.
Yeah, so it reaches a point where it becomes overwhelming, or there's too much fear of errors, there's too much anxiety, um, and but a lot of times though, in earlier stage companies, there's a lot of M&A in the biotech space. So a lot of times, someone who's got experience, they might acquire a company, or they might sell their company, or they might be involved in a startup. Those people just know right out of the box, we're going to need a royalty system. So let's just start with one. It'll be way less
Mm.
painful if
Well,
we just,
they had to have gone through that before
yeah,
in
they've
order
been
to
through
know
the pain.
that. Yeah,
They've been through the pain.
right.
So we have companies where their first system is a royalty system,
Oh wow.
because they know that if they're planning to grow a lot and there's a lot of dependency on intellectual property,
Mm.
that's going to become a hindrance to their growth. So let's
Oh,
just get that out of the way.
okay. Yeah, and I understand what you're saying about the trust thing, because it's a little bit of an honor system, right? They could audit you, but they don't want to have to go through that all the time. And
Right.
is the auditor going to catch everything and things like that? Yeah.
Exactly. And also, if you
So
have
it
a
does
good,
have there does have to be that level of trust, and if you keep making mistakes over and over, I hate to say this, but I will. Um, so that there's a landscaper that does it's really popular in our neighborhood, and we have a neighborhood email. Everybody has to track how they bill because they make mistakes all the time, but they're so good at their job that people are willing to kind of work through that. So anyway, I get the idea about the trust factor, and it's a real thing because they're not always seeing what's on the other side.
that's right. And then also, you want the ability to audit, and the company that's being audited, if they have a good system, they can say, here you go. Instead of spending days or weeks gathering the data, they
Oh,
just
you can get a printout or a
boom,
report.
here's all
Yeah.
your reports. This will
Okay.
prove everything for you. And the licensor is like, oh, cool, that makes it really easy to audit
Oh,
you
and that
guys. So
helps with the trust, yeah.
that helps with the trust. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in the term, so let's move into, Excel is good for a period of time, rudimentary is okay for a period of time, but let's say, the controller's involved, the CFO, the CEO, right? They're like, all right, we need to automate this. Are there different types of reasonable applications to manage this, or is it such an esoteric niche industry that really there's just one solution and maybe a few companies that do it?
Um, you mean in terms of this automating the royalty payout
Yes.
process? It's a very niche space. So I was visiting one of our biotech companies in California last week. And they said, you guys are the only ones we know of that do this.
Yeah.
And we're so psyched we found you guys because otherwise we'd be doing this manually. We've heard of other companies that claim to do it, but we know for sure that they're just one of those like snap-on, bolt-on, things to a bigger system that does a more broader IP. And it just doesn't, there's still a ton of manual effort and a ton of risk. I am aware of one or two other companies that do specialize in the royalty payout piece.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of us out there. Um, you know, uh,
Not a
uh,
ton.
Sorry,
Not a ton.
not oh no, no more than like maybe two or three that can really do this well.
Yeah. Wow. Um, okay. So I decide that I see the benefits of automating. Like with every system that gets implemented, right? And here at the FDA group, we've implemented all different types of systems. It requires time and
Mhm.
resources and things of that nature. What does the implementation look like for something like this in terms of time and resources, stuff like that? Oh,
Yeah.
and that's probably a question you can't answer because some of them are probably this big and some of them are this big, so it probably varies, but
Well, it does vary, but actually, fortunately, so I have this vivid memory, and I tell this story a lot. My COO and I, this was like 15 years ago, we were sitting in my office and we were like, God, every single implementation just feels like it's they're so hard. Let's go through and analyze at that point. I don't know, maybe we'd done like 15 implementations or something. Let's go through and analyze them and see if there's some way we can get this process more automated. So we looked at those 15 or 20 implementations we had done, and we had this amazing epiphany. They were all virtually identical. It's just we hadn't realized that.
oh,
And so once we came to that realization, and this is one of the things I like to think really separates us from the rest, is wow, this is a really standardized process. So we created a
mm,
standard project plan. You've got to get your agreements into the system. You've got to get all your products into the
uh-huh,
system and associate them with agreements. You've got to be able to get your sales into the system. Then you got to be able to run parallel runs of royalty. So compare royalty, you got all that in the system. Let's run last year's sales data and see how it compares to what we did. So it's a parallel run. You'll invariably have differences. You identify where those differences a mistake. Did you load the data in wrong? So you'll do these parallel runs. Some of our customers get it right the first time. That's pretty rare. On the other extreme, some of our customers take 9 or 10 tries. And but these parallel runs, because this is software, they're really easy to redo. You just load the data in and run it. And then the harder part is reconciling it for the customer to compare the results in the new system to what they did in the past and understanding why there's differences. Because at the very least, there's always going to be rounding differences. So
mm,
sometimes the differences are just pennies or dollars, but sometimes they're substantial. So when we came to that realization, we just got the process down, and we've just been. It's like that
mm,
was one of the biggest things that we discovered in our company's history is that every single implementation is virtually the same. Now, sometimes customers want to do a data cleanup before they migrate into our system, and that can add some time. Sometimes customers just don't have a good grip on where they don't really know they don't have a good system that kind of says, okay, these products are associated with this intellectual property, so that can add some time. But we're really good at helping customers through that because we've seen it enough.
mm.
So the answer to your question, how long it takes and what kind of resources, if a company has pretty good data, you can get up and running. And I mean, we always tell people that we don't like to do it in less than 3 months, but we've had situations where we had this one situation about 2 years ago, a company with tens of thousands of products. They had all their stuff hosted internally, including one of our competitors' system. They were using an older version of our competitor system. And, like many of us who've had internal systems, they had nightly backups running. Well, we don't know what happened. They never told us. I think it was a ransomware attack.
Uh,
Their all their systems got corrupted for everything.
oh,
Their accounting systems, because it was all hosted
oh,
internally. Um, their backups for some of their systems hadn't been working in 7 years.
oh my God.
Yeah, and they thought they were running every night. I remember when I used to be in the IT world and I'd set these backups, and you think they're running every night, and then you go check and it's like, oh my God, this hasn't been running.
Oh
Uh,
no.
and so these guys were like, they were in a bind, and they said
7 years?
7 years. So we were able to get them up and running in 2 weeks. It was not easy, but we were able to get their royalties out the door on time. They had 2 weeks to pay their royalties. We were able to
Wow.
get it done for them. Usually we say it takes 3 months. For bigger companies, it can take 6 to 9 months. We never it to take longer than that. We've seen others do implementations. I mean, I've seen horror stories. We saw other royalty implementations. And this one I'm thinking of it on the top of my head. Two of them I'm thinking of that come right to mind. Um, 2 years of implementations and hundreds of thousands of dollars in implementation costs, and they had to throw everything away. They just never
Uh,
got it to work. Those were both non-dedicated royalty systems, these like add-on platforms.
oh yeah.
The advantage to working with a company that specializes in this
Yeah.
is it's all they do. There's no substitute. When you implement any system, there's no substitute for experience. I mean,
Right.
a software implementation is probably everybody's experience at some time or other. It can be a total nightmare. The best way to mitigate that is to go with a company or people that have done it a lot and really know what they're doing and have a specialty in that domain. So that can really improve the implementation process.
Okay, so in addition to thinking I need to automate it, I need a system that's going to allow me to automate it. I also have to make sure that I'm factoring in if trust is important in this space, how am I implementing it? Is it somebody that has done this many, many times before and has a process or not? Because it's very much a junk in, junk out. And if I want to make sure that I'm eliminating mistakes, one factor I need to take into consideration is how many implementations has this company done before and what's their, rate of success.
Absolutely. I mean, honestly, I wouldn't work with a company that hasn't done at least a couple dozen implementations
Yeah.
because there's nuances and situations you encounter. I mean, I think to our early days and some of the challenges we had, back when we thought we knew everything, um, and we learned the hard way that we didn't. You don't want those people. I mean, back then there were no alternatives, so you needed us, but you don't want to work with those people. I've seen that fail just way too many times.
Yeah. Well, I know if I'm an audience member and I'm dealing with this, and I'm at a point where my controller, CFO, CEO is asking me about royalties, that's probably not the best thing, or somebody it's taking me too much time, or there's enough errors where it's impacting the business. I want to automate it. So I definitely want you to tell people where they could find you. Also, for people that are listening that are in this space, and they're maybe not ready to, fully automate this and invest in a software. Are there any like industry organizations or resources for those people responsible for this where, like if I'm in HR, I want to go to SHRM, right? And if I'm,
They're a
you know,
customer of ours.
okay. So, so like there might be some other industry organizations. Is there anything that's like that for royalties or not?
Unfortunately, no, it's so
Yeah.
niche. That said, we really try and provide. a ton of resources on our website. So I think our website, medicomment.com, is one of the best places to go for information.
Okay.
So royalties across industries, we work in several industries. They're very similar. And so we kind of have general information about royalties, but then we also have life sciences section of our site that you can go into that has some
Oh,
specialized information about life sciences royalties. But we have a lot of general information about royalties as well. And that applies to everybody that's got to pay out royalties because the concept is the same for virtually every industry out there. You got a contract, you got intellectual property, you got money coming in, and you got to pay the royalties out. And interestingly, the contract rules do tend to be really similar
um,
across industries. Like they're regional, they're based on the type of use, the type of product, there's stacked products,
oh, this is great. Yeah.
yeah. So we have a lot of
Um,
really good general information on there. I'm
yeah.
not really aware of any really good royalty resource other than that.
You did. You just answered it. It's your resources page, and
Yeah.
it's funny. We're really good at information too. So, we know all that's happening with FDA, with the new administration. And so over 50% of the people I talk to ask me what's going on. And as opposed to me trying to reiterate all of the information that we've come out with, we say, look, follow the FDA group page on LinkedIn and then go subscribe to our insider newsletter. You'll get everything you need to know what's happening at the agency and more. And I think this is probably the first time I went on somebody's website in the middle of a podcast, but it's my podcast. I can do that. And
There you go.
and I was looking, and it's a whole bunch of different guides. You got invention royalties, understanding agreements and calculations, how royalties are paid, a guide for licensees and publishers, agreements and reporting. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of it, and this is all new. This is all 2025. Not only 2025. I just read everything that was this quarter. So yeah, there's definitely, it looks like if they're not ready to talk to anybody at Metacomet, at least they can go to metacomet.com and get some information. And it's metacomet.com.
Yeah, thanks,
Um,
Nick. We put a lot of effort into that, into creating quality content. And we're coming out with a whole
yeah.
series of videos about it. So we're
Oof.
yeah,
I,
into
I,
it.
fe- I feel I feel fortunate for the people that are listening to this and they're like, wow, I didn't know there were answers. So that's great. Well, this is, I expected this was going to be interesting. I will say it's more interesting than I thought. It's fascinating as to the web of stuff that's involved. And so I've known you for a while. I don't think I really had a good appreciation for how complex this can get.
Yeah,
Um,
thanks. It's cool. It's cool. It's really cool. The whole industry without it relies on, royalties are such a core component, but they're the last thing anyone wants to think about because
yeah,
it's not the sexy part of the industry.
yeah, but it certainly can be a painful part.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this was a great podcast. I really appreciate you coming back. Before we close, is there anything else you'd like to leave the audience with?
No, I think you asked great questions, Nick. I really appreciate it. I think we talked about pretty much everything that I had on my mind to talk about. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Okay, awesome. Well, David, thank you so much for joining. And for everybody listening, as always, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network. If you haven't already, subscribe to get updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast. And like I said earlier, follow the FDA group on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you all next time.
All right, thank you, everybody.